Uhuru, my beautiful black brothers of the pure pigment path, it is that time of day where we sit ourselves down and recount the tales of legend, stories and fables of mighty figures whom through good graces or sheer willpower managed to form and build the world that we find ourselves living in. Whether they be paragons of virtue or agents of vice, conquerors or liberators, left twicks or right twicks, etc., etc. A single man can build a legacy so enduring that everyone wants to copy and imitate it. Like Caesar, Napoleon, or that one mustache man that I can never do a video on because I'm already treading on extremely thin ice as it is. Today's man is indeed one such figure, and like all of his aforementioned peers, he is actually black. As a matter of fact, he is an incredibly important black man that literally built the foundations that the New World Brothers established their identities on. He preceded and inspired the likes of Malcolm X and that one Martin guy that snuggled a woman and then got assassinated by the FBI, but that is a story for another time. Our man of the hour is nothing less than the architect of the modern black nation. He is the Black Maddie, the melanated Moses, the African Napoleon, the probably most racist man in history. He is Marcus Garvey. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. Oh, how did you get in here? Oh, the door was unlocked. Well, I guess I didn't hear you come in because of the active noise cancellation on these bad boys, Raycons. That's right, our sponsor for today is back with that audio quality that punches way above its weight at just half the price of other premium audio brands. And they're bringing the Everyday Earbuds Classic with them, which features the aforementioned active noise cancellation, which I love using to drown out my staff yelling at me about Madagascar. And they bring it up so much that the 8 hours of playtime and 32-hour battery life are completely indispensable. I've been into jiu-jitsu for a little while now, so I love putting in my Raycons and rolling around on my back like Gregor Samsa and practicing my grasps while listening to my heckin' action movie trailer song epic version because I am the main character, damn it. And my Raycons will play sad choral music when the rib breaker caves in my chest again. I've done my hardest, I just can't beat that guy. I mean, he's a lot bigger than me, but I'll get there one day. But anyway, the Raycons fit so comfortably in my ears with their optimised gel tips that they won't even fall out as I get the wind knocked out of me while falling foul of yet another single leg takedown. That's not what happened. So, if you want to get your hands on some of these bad boys in all of the fun colours that you know and love, then click the link in the description box down below or go to buyraycon.com/Dankula to get 20% off of the fan favourite Everyday Earbuds Classic. And a big thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video. On the 17th of August 1887 in St Anne's Bay, Jamaica, we begin our tale with the birth of Marcus Mosiah Garvey Jr., the son of a stonemason and servant. Marcus was one child of 6, the spawn of aforementioned stonemason and former slave Malcus Garvey. Due to the profession of the household patriarch, young Marcus grew up in what could easily be considered a family of snooty serfs, a petty bourgeois household. However, this wouldn't equate to much due to Big Malcus being absolutely shite with money, with his mother Sarah working as a servant to other households alongside her own. Because A black mother always has to hustle like the dad isn't around, even if he is. Here's a fun fact: because they are black New Worlders, they inherited their surnames from their old slave masters. A lot like that one chubby flower muncher that waffles on a lot about Locke. And the name Garvey is actually the anglicised version of O'Gerse, which is an Irish name. Yeah, really, Irish people owned slaves. Turns out they could afford them. But just look at Montserrat, which was Irish slavers with Irish servants and straight up brothers as slaves. And no, before you say a lot of the slavers were Catholic, Montserrat is its own dialect of Gaelic, all of this is just to say that indeed the Anglos were wrong. The Irish are actually white. They just like LARPing as third worldist losers because they're weird and possessed by the Wigger mind virus. But that's neither here nor there. Anyways, despite his financial impairment, Malchus was actually quite a smart cookie, being somewhat of an erudite with a hefty book collection and robust self-education, even going so far as to be a semi-recurring layman at his local church like some sort of upstanding citizen. But don't forget, Malchus is a black man. And like any good black man, he had no real relationship with any of his children, with sort of an exception to young Marcus. But we'll get into that later. Speaking of which, what of young Marcus? Well, Marky Mark attended a local church school up until the age of 14, in between partaking in the traditional pastime of black Jamaicans, no, not that one, manual labour on plantations. Indeed, despite being a member of the middle class, he was still a black boy in colonial Jamaica, and therefore the bottom of the social totem pole. Thus meaning he would spend his free time working on a tenant farm owned by his uncle, probably whistling and ham-boning amongst the sugarcane. When he wasn't toiling away like his ancestors, young Marcus was notably quite a bright lad, just like his father, as he would frequently find himself slinking away into Daddy's well-stocked study room to metaphorically eat a book for all of its nourishing knowledge, making his wrinkly brain even wrinklier. Though it's worth mentioning that Malchus was quite a cold father. You see, as a stonemason, one of his main crafts was creating tombstones for the departed men and women of St. Anne's Bay. This meant that on one occasion where Marcus was helping Daddy Dearest dig a grave, he decided to make the lad partake in some character building. Upon completing the empty grave, he had Marcus climb into it to fetch something. And then he pulled the ladder up, just left him in there, and then just went home. No, really. You see, Malchus was of the opinion that his boy was made far too soft and codependent due to his mother's mothering, and that only through physically struggling and toiling to drag himself out of the 6-foot-deep grave could he learn that he must become self-sufficient and reliable. Which, yeah, is a good lesson to teach your children, but fuck me, there are better ways to go about it that don't involve speedrunning abandonment issues. Unlike normal black Jamaican lads, young Marcus hung around with some unorthodox fellows that doubtlessly influenced his malleable young mind. You see, these fellows were white. Disgusting. But anyway, indeed, there were, and as a matter of fact still are, white Jamaicans. And Marcus was friends with a few of them due to being in what was functionally a white estate. Though, as he grew older, they grew more distant. Most likely because, frankly, being publicly associated with a brother would be seen as somewhat of a faux pas. Free man or not. As for an actual faux pas, there was the fact that one of these little playmates of Marcus's was a white girl by the name of Joyce Reary. Which, despite the fact that admittedly Jamaica wasn't quite as bad as, say, the Reconstruction era South in terms of race relations, because there were no formal laws based on race and they were a lot more to do with class, but still, this relationship was still a bit dicey, to say the least. However, for what it's worth, on reflection, Garvey commented fondly on said friend when he said, "We were two innocent fools who never dreamed of a race feeling and problem." Because of course, when you're just children, they were all neck deep in the "why can't we all just get along" type of Reddit philosophy. Marcus would, as we will see, diverge from that philosophy quite drastically. And now we get into the act that kick-started this supervillain's origin story. Because sadly for young Marcus, Madame Joyce had to leave Jamaica for a boarding school in Britain. And after giving him the standard farewells and adieus, she also told him that they were not to speak to each other ever again. As not only were they to be continents away from each other as well as the pressures of her old-fashioned father, but also for the sake of her wider social standing. Marcus obviously asked her, why? Why can't we be friends and why can't we still talk to each other? And she said to him, because you're a I'm not joking. I'm being completely serious. That is me directly quoting her verbatim. And as a matter of fact, this was the first time ever that Marcus had ever even heard that word. And it was said to him by a white woman who was supposed to be his friend and who he had a crush on. This, like his father's little grave antics before, would leave a deep imprint on young Marcus. And you know what? For what it's worth, the boys never called him that. Remember, lads, bros before hoes. Also, that word and also the word negro is going to be used a lot in this video, because I'm going to be quoting a lot of people from the late 1800s and early 1900s in a video that is essentially about race activism. So, as I'm sure you'll all be very, very shocked to hear, the word comes up once or twice. But I'll just get the editor to bleep all of them out because YouTube doesn't allow fun. Of course, like any other juvenile, Marcus would get up to the odd bit of hijinks with the boys, partaking in yet another black tradition of being arrested. In this case, for punting a rock through a church window. This goes to show that despite being sort of middle class, young Garvey could indeed embrace the pastimes of the working man and get lifted for partaking in cultural and divine vandalism. And look, smashing a window when you were a child, we've all done it. Speaking of which, I have something to get off of my chest almost 30 years later. Mrs. Crozier, it was me. It was a dare, and I'm very, very sorry. Of course, seeing as how he was shirking his studies and was milling around being a nuisance, he left school and was promptly put to work at the ripe age of 14. This was convenient timing as frankly his family were going through somewhat of a financial rough patch. He was first sent away to become an apprentice for his godfather, one Mr. Alfred Burroughs, as a printer. Because remember, this is 1901 and we don't quite have that clunky piece of shite that sits in our hallway yet. So we had to have people that did it manually. Beyond just getting money in his pocket and being off the streets, this gig with Burroughs was quite the boon for young Marcus, as his godfather had a well-stocked library that he now had access to, meaning that his already immense intellect could be bolstered alongside his purse. In time, though, he would move on from being a mere printer's apprentice and would relocate out to Port Maria, where his godfather had opened a new branch, and where young Marcus would find himself an occupation as a proper printer in 1904. His daily commute consisting of taking the horse from his home in St. Anne's Bay along 25 miles of country to get to work. As a bit of totally not foreshadowing, Port Maria was host to a branch of the little-known American outfit known as the United Fruit Company. That job evidently didn't really last that long because by 1905, Garvey had moved once more. This time to the west end of the capital, Kingston, specifically at 13 Pink Lane, in what was known at the time as Smith's Village, which, for context, was an even rougher working-class market district. Marcus would share a home with the family of one Thaddeus McCormack, yet another presumed black man with a Gaelic surname. How coincidental. It was in Kingston that Marcus began in the printers division of the P.A. Benjamin Manufacturing Company, a Jamaican company whom, amongst other things, made cosmetics. And for what it's worth, they're actually still around. Whether or not they're actually good, I've got no idea. And of course, I don't need any sort of glow-up. Big Garv ended up being quite the asset to the team, rapidly moving up the ranks and becoming the first Afro-Jamaican foreman in the company's history, becoming a master printer, doubtlessly making any white man underneath him seethe due to a brother being massa now, especially seeing as how he was by this point known for being quite prone to just inserting himself into any volatile situation. Including in one incident where he essentially squared up to one Tom Prang, a hired thug for a plantation that would be far too eager to just beat people up just for the sake of it. Garvey apparently just walked up to him and contorted his pudgy Malteser face into a locked-in INTJ stare whilst confronting the guy. Tom Prang then left town and never returned, clearly intimidated by a strong and independent black thinker who actually has a real job that isn't just beating up people. It was also during this time that young Garvey started his first newspaper, Garvey's Watchman. Did I find out what it was about? No, but the fact that he had a newspaper at all is a bit of a flex. The self-taught black man had a newspaper, even if it only lasted 3 issues and had a couple of thousand readers max. That's still a bit of a power move. This was also bolstered by Garvey's strange decision to get in contact with famed doctor, journal and proto-political black man Joseph Robert Love. Why? Well, not for politics, that comes later. Instead, he got in touch so that he could be tutored by him in the venerable art of speechcraft, specifically honing in on elocution, which for the unlearned is basically learning how to talk like a posh arsehole and sound smarter than you actually are. We should bring it back, to be honest. So at the very least, the poisonous hucksters that currently infest the high rungs of the media and political ecosystem stop sounding like a bunch of painfully stupid and crass melanoids when they peddle their ideological poison or push their pishy products. Wallahi, the insufferable roadman Nando speak will be cleansed from this earth come hell or high fructose. Anyways, despite this career success, Garvey became victim to the fruits of his own labour, as his mother and sister actually moved down to live with him due to old Malchus doing some fucky-wuckies that resulted in the mother Sarah and daughter Indiana being essentially estranged and now reliant on young Marcus. This domestic earthquake was then followed up by a real one, because on January the 14th, 1907, Kingston was subject to a series of tremors that were levelling out to 6.2 on the Richter scale, killing around 1,000 people and leaving the capital city in tatters. And the Garveys homeless. Thus, for the next few months, Marcus and his family had to quite literally sleep outside. This understandably put quite a lot of strain on not only Marcus, but his sister, and especially his mother, culminating in her death in March of 1908, at 56 years old due to cerebral apoplexy, or in layman's terms, a big bad brain bleed. This, understandably, was quite a harrowing period of time for Marcus, and he ended up finding comfort in the church, in time becoming a Catholic. In the meantime, his work at PA Benjamin wasn't ceasing or letting up, with everyone losing their homes and needing to pull a few extra hours to get some money together. The working environment had degraded somewhat, with conditions getting so severe that Garvey stepped up and became the vice president of the compositors section of the Printers Union. This was the first time that Marcus would properly dip into politics. This came right in time for Marcus to start campaigning for a cause that truly mattered to him. Getting rid of Indians. Yes, really, because at this time, much of the West Indies was being overrun by coolies, which, for the uninformed, were basically low-caste Indian labourers who'd come over to be battery farmed to work in plantations for very affordable prices. And Marcus really didn't like that. Because who wants to be in competition for jobs and housing with a bunch of people who accept Amazon gift cards as payment? But they could do nothing but stem the tide. And between the coolie wave and the increasing economic and demographic devastation from the earthquake, compounded by the death of his dearest mother, Garvey decided it was time to depart Jamaica, leaving the tutorial zone and partaking in some character building all on his own. Upon leaving Jamaica, Garvey found himself in Limon province in Costa Rica, where he decided to return to work on the plantations after his uncle did him a solid and hooked him up. Though he was not a mere labourer. After all, he had grown acclimated to managerial work, of course being one of the very few black intellectuals on the planet. Indeed, our very own Marcus Garvey was a timekeeper for a banana plantation. No, really, he was the tally man, literally tallying me banana. Daylight come and me wan go home. And this plantation was owned by none other than our old friends, the United Fruit Company. And wouldn't you know it, almost immediately after rocking up to his new workplace, he was understandably appalled by the working conditions of the labourers, for whom he as a timekeeper now had to manage. This culminated in the creation of yet another newspaper from Garvey, this time the bilingual agitprop known as La Nación, or, in a white language, The Nation. In La Nación, he would quite aggressively criticise the conduct of the UFC. No, not that one. Much to the chagrin of the gentry of Limon, who were deeply intertwined with the company and didn't take too kindly to some random black guy talking smack about their benefactors. The straw that broke the camel's back, however, was Garvey's coverage of a fire that had broken out in Limon's city centre. You see, the fire brigade were called in to put out the blaze that had subsumed a chunk of buildings, which included a bunch of local businesses. But what was particularly of note was that for whatever reason, the fire brigade had seemingly prioritised the dousing of a residence belonging to a white Jamaican by the name of Cecil Lando. And in the process of saving his Funko Pop collection, they didn't have enough water left over to adequately save those aforementioned businesses. And they all fucking burned down. And seeing as how Garvey was a former trade unionist, you can imagine that he would be rather critical of this situation. And because of the fact that he was a former trade unionist and, more importantly, an employee of the United Fruit Company criticising another higher up and, more importantly, white colleague, resulted in Garvey getting a knock on the door from the police, and he was brought in for questioning. Because if there is one thing that the United Fruit Company really hated more than black people, it was trade unions. And Brother Garvey just reeked of communist subversive with all of his paying workers minimum wage spiel. And wouldn't you know it, at the same time as being brought in for questioning, his printing press broke down right before his scathing article was set to be published, which begs the question as to how the feds knew about it beforehand. And, by complete coincidence, the only printer that had spare parts that was willing to offer assistance was directly owned by the United Fruit Company. So, it's fair to say that La Nación was kaput. Deciding that Costa Rica was for Melvins and that frankly he wasn't exactly welcome anyway due to shenanigans with funds for a local celebration of George V's coronation that I'm not going to cover because this video is going to be fucking long enough, Garvey proceeded to start generally touring Central and South America, doing odd jobs and generally nomad maxing. Eventually, he found himself in the colon of the New World, Cologne, where Garvey once again did what he did best. Start yet another fucking newspaper, this time known as La Prensa, or in a real language, the press. Now, its main audience was of course labourers, and for context, there were many, as by this point the Panama Canal was still being constructed. So there was a lot of money in circulation and an absolute shit ton of labourers imported to dig and die for the construction of it. And wouldn't you know it, a fair few of them were black, and almost all of them were utterly miserable. Because that canal was made atop a mountain of corpses. And dynamite. And another thing, because the canal was being constructed by and de facto owned by the United States, Jim Crow standards of payment were implemented amongst the labourers, with white workers getting paid a hefty chunk more than their melanated peers, who got a relative pittance in exchange for toiling in the blistering hot jungle while getting mukbanged by mosquitoes. This state of affairs doubtlessly influenced Garvey about the dynamics of race, seeing that despite the inherently prejudiced nature of it, it is an option to be separated from the white Neanderthal cave beasts, even if in this case the segregation is imposed by said beasts. This gave Garvey an awful lot to think about. Overall, though, his Panamanian fling didn't really amount to much, as in 1911, Garvey was bodied by his lower pay not being good enough and tropical diseases harnessing his latent asthma to leave him fever-ridden and deflated. So back to Kingston he went, hat in hand and hand over mouth. But you see, Kingston, low-key, kinda sucks arse. So as soon as he got better, Garvey immediately packed his shit up again. He said adieu to his mandem, and in 1912 he promptly fucked off. But this time to the Imperial Core in Old Blighty, to the once bustling zenith of civilization, London. No, really, it was a great place once. It was even once filled with these mythical beings called Englishmen. His reasoning to go into the belly of the white beast was quite simple. He wished to learn. After all, this shitty windswept little set of islands were the nucleus of a world-spanning empire and were at the cutting edge of science and culture. And they didn't even hate black people that much. Just a little bit. Upon arriving in the city via a literal fucking banana boat, he started renting himself a room in the Borough High Street in Southwark, where he would generally mill around, bedazzled by the gorgeous architecture and furnishings of high society. After trying and failing to find more high-caste employment, he would pick up work as a labourer down in the London docks, where he would have to once again make peace with being paid less than his native colleagues. When he wasn't working, he was spending his time sharpening his debate and oratory skills on the antiquated ideological dumping ground known as Speaker's Corner, where he would rub shoulders and partake in verbal fencing with the intellectual refuse of the day. And despite being a novice, Garvey had a trick up his sleeve that would get all of the audience to love him. He was black. You see, by 1912 there were only around 4,000 black people in the entire country. Better times. But anyway, this, paired with the borderline suicidal allure of Orientalism, meant that the second Garvey rocked up to the corner, he'd immediately have the attention of anyone. Because he's a devilish and dandy black man able to go mano a mano rhetorically with any white chap that crosses his path. As far as the public was concerned, he was the noble savage. He was probably the first black man that they had ever seen who was not only able to read, but was also able to engage in debate and present his points with prose. Virtually unheard of at the time and utterly disarming. What was, just a few decades ago, literal farm equipment had just rocked up in his Sunday best, spoke in perfectly coherent and poignant English, and then proceeded to clobber everyone in the marketplace of ideas. Utterly mogged. Concurrent with his shenanigans at Speaker's Corner, he also got the opportunity to visit the incestuous Viper's Pit legally designated as the House of Commons, which would have not only bolstered Garvey's burgeoning political prowess, but also exposed him to the current man of the hour, David Lloyd George and the Liberals, who, fun fact, were made up of former Whigs. Who the fuck are the Whigs? Well, all you need to know is that they caused the famine and the modern Tories are trying to become them. Garvey was rather charmed by Big Dave, and he found him to be quite the inspiration. If not in policy, then at least in prose. Because frankly, I can't imagine Dave would be particularly fond of what Garvey would end up positing. But we'll get into that later. Fact of the matter is, Garvey was thriving in the Imperial Corps. Between all of this, he would find himself moseying on down to the local libraries, where he would once more engage in bibliographic mukbangs, chowing down on tomes to absorb all of the juicy knowledge that could be found within, making his wrinkly banana brain bulge and thump with everything from high culture and theory all the way down to gritty pub trivia. Truly unmatched black intellect. As you could probably tell, Garvey was doing quite well for himself in London, so it's no surprise that his sister once again came over to live with him, picking herself up work as a domestic servant, because there weren't enough stereotypes present in this story already. He was also able to actually get something of a formal education in the form of evening classes at Birkbeck College, studying law. And no, I'm quite sure that image of him isn't actually him graduating. But I had it sitting there and I wanted to use it somewhere. Because look at him. Goofy little guy. Eventually, in 1913, Garvey managed to get himself out of the dockyards and get himself some employment in a field a bit more up his alley. That's right, it's another fucking newspaper. But hold your horses, this one wasn't started by him. Instead, it was another pioneering black chap who had set it up, and Garvey was merely a contributor. Indeed, Garvey had become a contributor for the African Times and Orient Review, a Fleet Street-based magazine dedicated to the happenings of Africa and the East, respectively. In their words, they were a monthly paper devoted to the interests of the coloured races of the world. Founded by another black eccentric, Dubois Muhammad Ali. No, not that one, who for context was a Sudanese chap that basically did the exact same thing as Garvey. Mill around random countries and opening newspapers. Master Deuce became quite the mentor for the young Garvey, with both of them being entrepreneurial and distinctively melanoid gentlemen who had a vested interest in academia and politics. And seeing as how Dubois was an actual African king, Sudan was actually part of Egypt at the time, and an avowed home ruler. And despite not being particularly swayed by Dubois' fantastical writing style or sense of prose, Garvey was still inspired by his business acumen and his sense of political assertiveness. The thing is, though, is that while Garvey is many things, loyal to magazines is not one of them, as he would start contributing on the side to the Tourist magazine. Because despite his cushy position in African Times and Orient Review, it wasn't cushy enough to, actually put food on his plate. And despite not being as highbrow and pointed as his works in the review, the Tourist was lucrative enough that the odd article could actually help a brother out in exchange for easy work. Garvey would very often find himself wandering down to the British Museum to pilfer its library of yummy tomes and grimoires. Amongst these, he found himself a novel little piece which was titled up from slavery by one dark fellow known as Booker T. Washington. You might have heard of him. And yes, Garvey was influenced by him. He's like an ideological sponge, that boy. Garvey even had the opportunity to partake in a good old-fashioned grand tour. No, an actual one. He floated around Europe taking in the cultures and languages of the locals, including the likes of Bologna, Monte Carlo, Madrid, Paris, and for some reason, Glasgow. Because of course, Glasgow is obviously renowned for its Mediterranean vibes and high society. The thing is though, the review and the tourist didn't really pay super well after all. And before he knew it, he was left penniless and on the cusp of a fate worse than death. Being forced to go back to Jamaica. And, despite Garvey's best efforts at finessing the state by trying to get the Colonial Office and fucking Anti-Slavery International to pay for his passage home, those methods didn't work. So he rocked up to the Colonial Office and essentially just shouted, "Deport me!" And they told him, "No, you can remigrate yourself with your own money." And so, in June of 1914, with gritted teeth and hat in hand, he did just that. Boarding the SS Trent, he got himself out of there and back to Jamaica. Though this 3-week trek was not without happenings, however, as on board he found himself becoming quite chummy with a fellow West Indian chap who had just returned from some missionary work in Basuto land, or as it is currently known, Lesotho. You know, it's that wee holy bit in the middle of South Africa. No, the other one. Anyways, the reason that I bring this up is that this man had just been to the motherland and had a few weeks to sit in his thumbs and shoot the shit with Big Garv while they crossed the Atlantic. And boy howdy was Garvey intrigued by his yarns, because he was able to gain an insight into how the old country worked and fared under the cruel yoke of the white man. And it got Garvey thinking. Thinking about how if the black man was organised and modernised, they would be a real force of nature. All they would need is a suave and organised outfit of noble and intellectual New World N-words to teach them of the devil's ways and bring forth the Black Renaissance. A true Dark Enlightenment. And how the leader of this new movement totally needed a name that rhymed with Schmarcus Schmarvey.
Beethoven.
Black.
Mozart.
Black.
Cleopatra.
She looked black, but she was white.
July of 1914 sees Marcus Garvey once more setting foot in Jamaica. And after picking up a bit of side money selling tombstones and smuggled condolence cards like Pappy before him, he was finally ready for his grand unveiling. The Universal
Negro
Improvement Association and African Communities League, or as it's commonly known, the UNIA. This organisation was created by Garvey with one simple goal in mind: Black unity. Donning the motto, one aim, one God, one destiny. They were indeed dedicated to rallying the disparate blacks of the world under their tricolour. Does that flag look familiar? Yeah, that's how influential they are. I'll get into their beliefs in depth later, but for now, all you need to know is that they really, really, really loved being black. But these things were humble beginnings for the organisation. Based out of Orange Street in Kingston, they essentially began their life as a charitable organisation for downtrodden blacks. And that in due time they would pool the finances and manpower needed to build themselves a vocational college. Because Garvey was inspired by the Tuskegee Institute. That particular inspiration did not fucking age well, despite the good intentions. But that was the white man fucking with them, so whatever. Now, you might expect such an outfit of proud black men and women to be quite opposed to the happenings and struggles of the white man. But you'd actually be somewhat wrong. Because in 1914 there was actually a rather big white man happening that had just kicked off over in the Old World. And wouldn't you know it, the UNIA had some thoughts on it. The UNIA formally pledged their allegiance and undying loyalty to the British Empire. No, seriously, they actually fucking did. Garvey even went as far as to write personally to King George V to tell him as much. Now, you're probably wondering why the avowed black supremacist and black imperialist order was so eager to fall in lockstep and fight for a white king and a white country. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. Beyond Garvey's subdued crypto-Anglophilia, there was also raw pragmatism. You see, Garvey was of the opinion that if he and the UNIA were to make themselves useful for the war effort by encouraging Jamaicans to enlist, they would not only gain legitimacy and recognition as an organisation, but they would also get a platform from which that they could further recruit more black people from across the empire. Though, and this is conjecture on my part, I do get the feeling that this line of thinking comes from Garvey's other weird fixation caused by dormant blood, his well-documented hibernophilia. You see, at the time, Ireland was in a somewhat tense state, with the Home Rule Bill on the cusp of being ratified on the island, only to be delayed due to a world war breaking out. This resulted in quite a lot of unrest in the country. In response, a not insignificant cadre of Irish nationalists willingly volunteered to enlist in Kerryman Kitchener's new British Army, and they did this as a sign of good faith, because Ireland wasn't subject to conscription unlike the rest of Britain. This resulted in around 31,000 men willingly enlisting in the meat grinder for self-determination. And that was inspiring. Granted, it didn't really end super well, but that's a story for another time. Either way, Garvey saw the plight of Irish nationalism as an inspiration and foundation, seeing as they were fellow blacks, of course. Now, where were we? Well, when Brigadier General L.S. Blackton was invited to lecture the UNIA on how the war was going, Garvey publicly backed Blackton's calls for more West Indian volunteers, making old Blackton very, very happy. But then Blackton became very, very unhappy and started getting very, very pissy about the quality of said troops, complaining that they were unmotivated layabouts, essentially just showing up for a free meal, and couldn't give less of a shit about the great struggle of the empires. But that's by the by. Now, you've probably got a somewhat decent idea as to what our boy Marcus was like. A budding intellectual with a penchant for finessing when push came to shove, who can speak a house down, and he loved to flex his oratory skills by setting up elocution contests. Yes, really. But you know what else he was? A massive fucking simp. Indeed, our Garvey was smitten with the wiles of a woman. Yuck. Specifically, the recent addition of the UNIA's roster of femoids known as Amy Ashwood. Having recently graduated from the Westwood Training College for Women, she came into the organisation and contributed to the cause in the only way a woman can. No, not that way. You dirty fuck. She did what most women do. Spent other people's money. In particular, she dished out an inordinate amount of cash on renting a new dwelling ground for the group by sinking her father's credit rating. And naturally, this made Garvey blush. Garvey was love-struck, and before they knew it, they were embroiled in quite the romance, eventually becoming engaged in 1915. Sugoi. There was a slight issue, however. Amy's parents did not approve, and feeling as though it was either Marcus or the family, she proceeded to call off the marriage. To which Garvey then proceeded to outwoman the woman and channel his inner teenager by threatening suicide unless she reneged on her cancellation and married him right fucking now. She relented. Moral of the story is, if you want a woman, manipulate her. Gaslight, gatekeep, Garvey boss. Now, Madame Ashwood was a good source of income. But if you're trying to save and uplift the black race into greatness, you'll need, amongst other things, a wide and varied roster of patrons. And despite what you may think, the UNIA was able to get its fair share from almost every demographic, including whites. Yes, really. Through some S-rank schmoozing and social claiming, they somehow managed to get white elites like the fucking governor of Jamaica as their patrons. There was one wrinkle, however. In the act of courting the white elites, the UNIA ended up alienating another group. Not the blacks, they were all still chill with Garvey. I'm talking about the middle-class, mixed-race people. Apparently, they absolutely fucking hated Garvey, due in no small part to the fact that not only were they being stepped over by a pretentious brush shucker, but also because they were getting offended over how the UNIA was using the term
negro.
Because the blacks can't co-opt a slur used to offend themselves lest some fucking mystery meat gets offended. The thing is though, despite being relatively limited in number, this was still a big enough cohort of enemies to cause some bother, mainly through circulating unfounded rumours of Garvey pocketing the UNIA's funds. Despite his habitual finessing, this genuinely has no evidence to support it. Though, despite that, the reputation of the group started diminishing. Realising that Jamaica was no longer the promised land for his burgeoning movement, Garvey yet again packed his shit and vacated Jamaica for like the 5th time, but this time with his posse in tow. Their destination being the place where they will strike it big and start making waves. A veritable goldmine of racial turbulence, and more importantly, black disillusionment just waiting to be plundered. Next stop, the United States.
I think America is racist.
Oh my God. You know, I remember my great-grandfather told me something like that. But, you know, he was like a slave or something.
Upon landfall in the land of freedom and federal overreach, Garvey found himself in the Black Zion of Harlem. He immediately got himself out and about by doing speeches to the unenlightened masses. This, frankly, didn't go well, because on his first speech he was a bumbling and stuttering mess, clearly caught with a particularly nasty spell of stage fright. Apparently, he not only got heckled, but that his nerves were that shot that he physically fell off of the stage into the crowd. Trust me, even for the most experienced of orators, having a joke bomb stings hard and it fries nerves. So, I could only imagine having that happen to you when you accidentally belly flop into a bunch of black people in the audience. They could have thrown chairs. Deciding that New York was far too high a level for this early in the campaign, Garvey began to tour the US proper. Not just to take inventory of the black bodies ripe for the plucking and crowdfunding money for a vocational school in Jamaica, but also to interface with the myriad black groups and institutions dotting the United States, including a visit to the aforementioned Tuskegee Institute, alongside, more importantly, going to church. Specifically, a Black Baptist church. You know, the type of ones that make Sunday Mass into a Das Right-fueled dance sesh. But we can all make fun of it as much as we want. I'm sorry, but black church looks fun. Deciding that the uplifting jive of the
negro
communion was enough of an XP boost to warrant a return to New York after a small 6-month side quest. Upon returning, he formally opened the New York branch of the UNIA, declaring membership open to anyone who was willing to pay the 25 cents per month fee and was, of course, black. Now look, accounting for inflation, that equals around $6 a month. Despite that, however, I do get the sneaking suspicion that it still filtered quite a lot of people from joining. You know, just call it a hunch. Alongside this, Garvey returned to the stepladders and street corners of New York to once more try his craft at oration. This time, he found much more success in getting his strange messages across. He even found himself some like-minded black colleagues to enter an informal alliance with, particularly one influential nerd named Hubert Harrison. You see, Hubert here had his own operation going that wasn't too dissimilar from Garvey's, having his own newspapers and political fraternities in the form of the Liberty League, to which Garvey had attended an inaugural meeting for. Unlike Garvey, however, Harrison's ideology was a lot more cutting edge and trendy, incorporating this hip new train of thought called socialism, even going out of his way to organise the black man on behalf of the Socialist Party of America. So of course, this would start to influence Big Garv, because again, he's just a massive ideological sponge. In April of 1917, another happening happened. The United States decided to ruin the course of human history by ditching its isolationism and getting involved in World War I. With the arch-lich in charge, like many in the nation, Garvey was suddenly enraptured by another country's patriotic fervour for some fucking reason, deciding that this time he was going to enlist in the US military and fight for Uncle Sam. Okay, I'll do it. I'm batting for you, Woodrow. I'm Wilson's top guy. And Uncle Sam didn't want him, because he was a fat foreign black guy who literally just showed up and already tried to politically rock the boat through organising disparate black communities into a cohesive demographic unit. Garvey mauled about being rejected so much that he ended up turning around and becoming anti-war, telling his followers that there would be no point shedding any blood for the white man. Of course, the black man wouldn't have to go across the Atlantic to see some action, as in May, when the race riots in Illinois broke out and around 100 black people lay dead, Garvey decided to essentially Fed post, detailing how the black man needed, quote, armed self-defense. And he even started handing out pamphlets detailing how there was a conspiracy afoot over shenanigans in Illinois. And wouldn't you know it, a certain government-owned precursor organisation called the Bureau of Investigation started monitoring Big Garv for being a person of interest. I wonder who this group would eventually become. But the thing is about Garvey is he was just too bloody charming, as come 1918 he had managed to convince most of Harrison's Liberty League to de facto defect to the UNIA, even getting the favourable sway of journos back when their jobs were actually somewhat respectable. There was a slight wrinkle to that, however, as the journal in question, one John Edward Bruce, was trying to build a solid profile of Garvey in order to fill his shoes. As for context, Garvey had agreed to step down from the UNIA presidency in exchange for Bruce taking the mantle. Bruce wrote to our old Fezd friend in London, Mr. Ducey, inquiring into his time with Garvey. Apparently Ducey was quite miffed that his former apprentice ended up making it big overseas, and apparently just spouted a bunch of shite to Bruce about how Garvey set up the UNIA in order to pocket the donations. You may remember that this isn't the first time that this accusation has come up, despite there being no proof of this. It still makes you think. This shocking testament from Big Ducey was then read aloud by Bruce during a UNIA meeting with Garvey present in order to publicly put pressure on him in what essentially amounted to a soft coup. And in an absolute shit fit that only made him look more guilty, Garvey proceeded to resign from the presidency and started up what was essentially the Provisional UNIA in protest. Then he fucking sued every single one of them. And surprisingly enough, the courts concluded that the UNIA was rightfully the domain of Master Garvey. So that black schism didn't really amount to much. So, with that brief coup attempt squashed and set aside, it was high time for the UNIA to consolidate and actually grow. Come July of 1918, the UNIA, alongside its commercial wing, incorporated. And wouldn't you know it, wee Marcus just couldn't help himself and started yet another fucking newspaper. This time, it was called the
Negro
World, which would become by far his most successful rag in his career, being such a good outlet for his propaganda that it was de facto banned from distribution in India and essentially the entire continent of Africa, due to its rather incendiary messaging. Now, you might think that a black newspaper was quite the niche in terms of publication, but you'd be wrong, as by that point in the United States, there were an estimated 400 separate black newspapers all in competition with each other. So, what did Garvey do to set his rag apart? Simple. Be the blackest newspaper of them all, by refusing to advertise any products that pertain to skin lightening or hair straightening, claiming that the black race must, and I quote, take the kinks out of your mind instead of out of your hair. Yep, that's right, get your kinky mind sorted and stop consuming Korean gub-gub ointments. Take the fucking weave off, Shanquisha, and celebrate your heritage. Oh, and Garvey also refused to pay his journalists for their scoops, and they tried to sue him for it constantly. The
Negro
World was not without conflict, however, as Garvey allocated command of the newspaper to one Wilfred Domingo, a friend of his and, as it turned out, a fervent supporter of the proletarian persuasion, specifically the more radical revolutionary flavour. Upon seeing this persuasion manifest in his writings, Garvey brought him before a 9-person UNIA tribunal to get a dressing down for infesting his black media with commie drivel. Domingo was so offended by this anti-Labour action that he and Garvey ended up becoming bitter enemies, with dickhead Domingo going on to get himself involved with some other dipshit commie nobodies. Now, remember Amy Ashwood, the 2-bit black hussy that Garvey was fawning over? Well, she's still around. In 1918, she ended up becoming the group's general secretary alongside the group designated Women TM, doing all of the required femoid activity like, and I'm not joking, reciting black poetry at meetings. Thank you for your service, madam. The thing is, 1918 was important for another reason. Mainly the end of the First World War and the stupid assertions of Woodrow. And one of these assertions that would come up at the peace talks was the 14 points. Long story short, all of the worst parts of it came into effect and the few good ones got neutered into being shit. I'm looking at you, point 12. Garvey heard of this really big important thing happening overseas and he promptly met with fellow learned blacks to form the, and I'm not joking, this is actually what it was called, International League for Darker People. Very nondescript, I know. Regardless, their whole shtick was to try and lobby Wilson in order to get a crumb of rights and liberties for the coloured masses. You know, the standard stuff. But anyways, they couldn't actually even attend the fucking thing because they didn't get the right travel documents. So, in a rush, a UNIA member was hastily sent out to represent the entire black race in their stead. This African avatar was one Eliezer Cadet, a Haitian chap whom, by the way, was a literal fucking voodoo priest. No, I'm being completely serious. They sent a literal fucking voodoo priest to functionally represent the black and coloured races of the New World at the World War I peace talks. Oh, to be a fly on that wall. Naturally, nobody was really willing to talk to this literally who because they were all far too busy deciding the fate of the world. He was basically shoved into the corner with Liberia. But even in this metaphorical corner, Eliezer found no friends, as upon explaining to the Liberian delegate the group's desire to see the former German territories in Africa returned to black people, the Liberian, Charles D.B. King, basically told him, "You're dumb, go away." This is a Liberian saying this, by the way. Eliezer complained to Garvey in writing, claiming that the lack of interest from the delegates was not down to them being a bunch of backwater blacks who had no reason to be there, it was instead down to the nefarious actions of a group, and specifically a man that I've yet to mention because it's an entire topic in and of itself. William Edward Burgart Dubois, another contemporary titan of the black race, also had delegates at the peace talks from his own group, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, or, as you all know it, the NAACP. Without getting into the nitty-gritty, Garvey and Dubois fucking hated each other. They absolutely fucking hated each other. Not just due to them both competing for the soul of the black race, but due to the fact that in a couple of aspects, they were very, very different. Mainly that Dubois was for integration and uplifting within the United States, whilst Garvey, well, wasn't. But we'll get into that later, don't worry. This personal beef didn't really amount to that much, barring occasional shit-flinging. Not exactly conducive to constructive dialogue, but incredibly entertaining. For example, Dubois in Century magazine said of Garvey, and I quote, "He is a little fat black man, ugly but with intelligent eyes and a big head." This petty antagonism was near constant between these two, metaphorically shaking their fists at each other while trying to out-black the other, even apparently culminating in an awkward encounter in an elevator, where Dubois saw Garvey enter a room and in response, he just awkwardly shuffled away. This exact same thing actually happened with me and Mike Graham when we accidentally ended up in the same green room. And Mike Graham slunk away from me because he's a fucking pussy. But anyway, all that means is that when Garvey was told by Eliezer that Dubois had tampered with the peace talks, Garvey completely believed it. So, with the peace talks falling through on multiple counts, Garvey had to refocus his efforts on further consolidation rather than handouts from the international stage. But thankfully, the First World War had another gift to give to the black movements of the day. You see, all of the veterans were coming home. And wouldn't you know it, there were brothers amongst them. Brothers who, after fighting and dying for their country, now came home to be stomped on by those who stayed. Naturally, this demographic made the UNIA very excited, and the federal government very uncomfortable. Especially in the light of the shenanigans currently going on in Russia at the time. This meant that the already monitored Garvey would be put under a lot more surveillance. This culminated in a spook. I'm not being racist for once. I mean, yeah, he was black, but he just was literally a spook named Walter Loving going undercover to investigate the man. And he concluded that despite being a fat, weird foreigner, Garvey was a clear threat to the federal status quo. Upon reading this, Walter's boss, one J. Edgar Hoover, you might have heard of him, decided that Garvey was an active menace, and more importantly, politically black. And he concluded that he must be deported from the United States post-haste, adding his name to the upcoming Palmer raids, which, for context, were a series of raids meant to round up and deport leftists and anarchists in response to the Russian Revolution. And, by complete coincidence, most of those who were targeted were Italians and Jews. How curious. Moving on. Presuming that Garvey was just overflowing with incriminating evidence due to him being black, Hoover put his name forward to the Labour Department to ratify his deportation. The Labour Department refused, because despite being black, Garvey hadn't provably done anything wrong, and thus couldn't be justified in his remigration. I know, poor feds getting foiled by due process. Womp womp.
I got beans, greens, potatoes, tomatoes, lamb, rams, hogs, dogs, chicken, turkeys, rabbits, you name it! God damn it!
Come 1919, Garvey was on the up and up. Despite constant harassment from the US government and cold shoulders from the international stage, the UNIA was steadily growing into quite the sensation, with the organisation, according to Garvey, having upwards of 2 million members throughout the West Indies and North America. Now, I like you, Garv, but frankly, I don't fucking believe that. Now, despite that, I do honest to God believe that Garvey and the UNIA were a big enough group in the scene to warrant governments getting a little bit antsy. Especially when he started getting the critical mass to warrant massive marches in Harlem, with him shouting quippy slogans from the back of a Cadillac. Because of course it was a fucking Cadillac. This man knew his audience. To boot, by this point, the UNIA had something of an aesthetic to it, with the good men of the newly founded African Legion donning a somewhat martial attire, arguably becoming, in more ways than one, the first black shirts. This doubtlessly had the federal government absolutely shit in it, as not only were they a large player on the black political scene, but they were also quite evidently militarising, at least aesthetically. And worse yet, Garvey even had his own secret service to collate data on his own members to monitor for potential informants. I mean, for God's sake, even their women's detachment, the Universal Motor Corps, was in uniform. And worse yet, they were black women with semi-normal BMIs. Do you know how rare that is? It's an ominous sign of things to come, because think about the stereotype of Jamaican men. Then contemplate what happens when you have a large population of sexually deprived young men with no outlet for their growing violent urges. Food for thought. But anyway, someone could end up getting hurt. And you wouldn't call the Red Cross. Oh no, because that's right, Garvey had that covered too with, and I shit you not, the fucking Black Cross. Truly genius naming scheme, Garv. You took the red part and you made it black. Only a high IQ wordsmith like you could possibly come up with such a stunning play on words. I bet that bitch Dubois didn't have his own medical corps. Of course, this political extremist drip wasn't just for the rank and file. Oh no, as you see, Garvey himself quite famously had a uniform of his own, as he decided himself something of a Black Nelson and donned a full Admiral's uniform. A rather curious choice to say the least. You see, Garvey thought himself as nautically inclined, not only due to being born in the West Indies, but also due to a new business of his that I'll get into later. During the first international conference of the
Negro
Peoples in August of 1920, Garvey had arguably his most daring rhetoric yet, managing to gather upwards of 25,000 people in Madison Square Gardens. He boldly proclaimed that not only was the UNIA a legitimate government in exile to be recognised by the world at large, but that Marcus Garvey himself was the Provisional President of Africa. In essence, claiming the entire continent as his rightful domain. And fun fact, Dubois was actually snarkily invited to this by Garvey as a way to say, haha, look at how important we are, but Dubois just told him to go fuck himself. Now, this utterly absurd statement from an equally absurd group and man would just be laughed off as a really fucking weird LARP black power fantasy were it not for the fact that those in attendance included the Mayor of Monrovia, which is the capital of Liberia, and His Royal Highness Prince Kojo Tovolo Huenu, exiled monarch of the Kingdom of Dahomey. Yes, that Dahomey. The place that did the super slavery under King Gezo that you might have heard about from some naughty history boys on YouTube. So, why the actual fuck was literal African nobility hanging out in New York City with some pudgy peacoat-clad bumbleclat who's essentially trying to wee-wuzz his way into being Black Caesar? Well, it turns out they actually agreed on quite a few things. You see, long story short, Kojo-kun lost his kingdom to the French, and the shame of being taken over by the French led him down the path of the Chudda, making him a jaded fuck who really wanted his land back but was so utterly blackpilled that he never believed it feasible. And then this Garvey fellow shows up and was saying all of the right things and seemed to have the momentum behind him to actually maybe have something happen. Despite this pedigree and honorary issuing out of African chivalric orders to those in the crowd themselves were actually quite mixed in the reception, due mainly to the fact that the supposed dear leader of the hypothetical melanocratic empire was to be some random Afro-Jamaican in a bicorn, and not an actual native African. And because frankly, Garvey told them things that they didn't want to hear. Like, until you produce what the white man has produced, you will not be his equal. Not to posthumously feed into his already massive messiah complex, but I mean, you know? So having a conference and a declaration is all well and good. But what the fuck was the actual plan for this whole movement? Like, we keep hearing about how the UNIA are causing quite the stir and upset, but what is it that they actually want? And how are they going to do it? Well, I'm glad I made you ask. You see, once upon a time there was this little country called Liberia. I might have mentioned them a couple of times. And you see, their whole thing was the result of a bunch of black American slaves being freed and being sent there to be resettled throughout a good chunk of the 19th century. Those freed slaves ended up fizzling out and dying due to disease and a lack of skills in frontiersmanship, but the survivors, being ex-slaves, knew a few things about slavery. So they enslaved all of the native Africans and had the country descend into a schizophrenic free-for-all. Well, how about that? Either way, the plan was deceptively simple. Have all of the black diaspora of the New World organise, upskill and resettle Africa to not only escape the evil and oppressive clutches of the fluoride fae, but also empower and enrich a black homeland able to stand and flourish independently of said powers. Basically, they wanted to colonise Africa with deracinated blacks to technologically and societally leapfrog the continent into a perceived higher state of being, whilst also getting away from the goddamn honkies. And right on cue, an opportunity arises. You see, Liberia was by this point in a spot of bother debt-wise, due to the American government promising $5 million worth of aid to help the country through World War I, as well as prop up their rubber industry. The Americans, however, reneged on the deal, and Liberia was left dependent on British West Africa for loans. And with Britain controlling 2/3 of rubber production on the planet and Liberia being reliant on the export of it, meant that the Liberian economy was in a very fucking tenuous spot. Debt interest notwithstanding. But the UNIA had been busy little beavers building rapport with the Liberian government, and they posited them a proposition. The UNIA would raise $2 million for a construction loan for the Liberian government to bolster their domestic industry. And in return, the UNIA would be given large stretches of land in the country for development. After sending over a team to assess how viable the country is for New World enrichment, everything was cleanly lining up for this to be the first step in what would be the Great Black Aliyah. What could possibly go wrong? White people. Yeah, the Liberian government got a better deal from the Firestone Corporation, who, upon seeing this nice and rubber-rich landmass going for very cheap, got very, very excited and shot them a deal. And because they were frankly more reputable and not a gaggle of jodhpur-clad weirdos, they got the deal, and the UNIA got hung out to dry. Despite this setback, Garvey tried to maintain going on the up and up, creating multiple black-owned businesses under the tenureship of his newest project, the
Negro
Factories Corporation, whose sole shtick was to be a vehicle for black investors to pull money into to promote the creation of black-owned businesses. It was under this umbrella that Garvey opened up things like restaurants, grocers, a millinery, and a range of other such ventures to try and uplift the common black man without being a dirty communist about it. Alongside this, Garvey also finally got married to wee Amy Ashwood on Christmas Day. This happy spell was then rendered null as Garvey had the marriage annulled because Ashwood, frankly, was a bit of a floozy. Though Garvey wasn't much better because he ended up eyeing and courting his now ex-wife's bridesmaid, one Amy Jacques, another Jamaican who seemingly used her feminine wiles to lead our guy astray and have him wrapped around her finger. Not unlike the first Amy. Now, you might think that Garvey dodged a bullet with his presumed bitch ex-wife, and you could very well be correct. Now, here comes the bullets that he didn't dodge. In October of 1919, a vendor for the
Negro
World walked up to Garvey and dispensed the John Lennon special by firing 4 shots at point-blank range from a .38 revolver. Through what I can only assume was an act of divine intervention, Garvey managed to survive the shooting, having 2 bullets going through his right leg and 1 grazing the side of his temple. But the gunman himself wasn't so lucky. Upon getting himself arrested, he actually killed himself by jumping out of a 3rd-story window, conveniently right before he could get properly questioned about his motives. The jury to this day is still out on the motives of the assassin, whether it was an op from the federal government, a hit carried out by some rivals like that bitch Dubois, or even just a lone gunman who for whatever reason felt wronged by Garvey. The only potential proof was that the gunman had said Kilroe had sent him, which was most likely referring to the assistant district attorney for New York at the time. Whether or not he was being honest, we obviously can't say. But what we can say is that Garvey was back out at the rallies within a week of having a brush with death. And he even typecast himself a personal bodyguard in the form of one Marcellus Strong. Good name. Strong name.
They don't say congratulations, but you know they watch that shit. I ain't even gonna get mad. I'm young, black and rich. She trying to sell me.
Now, you're all aware of the White Star Line, right? You know, the mid-Atlantic shipping company famed for its speedy passenger lines between the United States and white countries, alongside more notably its venerable repertoire of icebreaker vessels able to brave the northern seas with a commendable 0% survival rate. Yet Garvey was enamoured by the concept of a shipping company that would ferry black people and black goods made by black companies in ships owned and manned by black sailors across the seas to black countries. In essence, kickstarting and nourishing a completely independent black economy. Basically, take any abstract function of societal commerce and paint it black. That is what Garvey wanted. As you can tell, he really was a behemoth of intellect. Thus, we have Garvey channeling his inner Bowie and founding the creatively named... You already know what it's called, don't you? The Black Star Line. The issue was that they didn't actually have a ship yet. But that should be fairly easy to get a hold of, right? Well, it was a lot more complicated than you would expect, because for a start, the company had only barely managed to get off the ground by Garvey guilt-tripping all of the black donors into buying stocks by declaring that if they didn't, then they were essentially race traitors. Brother, if you don't give me money, then you ain't black. With initial funding secured, they then of course went on to actually try and get a ship for them to ship in. And they got one. The Canadian-built SS Yarmouth. But there was just a slight little wrinkle with that, because Garvey struggled to find a big enough number of eligibly skilled black seamen to actually man the vessel. This resulted in multiple high-ranking positions on the ship being manned by whites. Black supremacists relied on whites for expertise. You couldn't make that shit up. After its maiden voyage to Cuba and Jamaica, the crew came back with some troubling news. The ship is a piece of shit, and it's racked with all kinds of problems. But after $11,000 worth of repairs and retrofits, the Yarmouth was then ready for its second voyage. And Then bad weather struck, and that required it to be towed back to New York. Despite this very obvious sign that maybe maritime trade just wasn't Garvey's strong suit, he pressed on and got himself a second ship, paying an obscene $11,000 in a deposit for some paddle boat called the SS Shadyside. For context, that's upwards of $160,000 on a deposit for a boat that was by that point almost 50 years old and was only really designed for inland travel, not ocean travel. This, as we will see, will be one of many of Garvey's big fuck-ups, because, spoiler alert, he never actually got the boat. Regardless, that was just a deposit. They hadn't actually got the boat yet. In the meantime, Garvey made himself busy by sacking the company's secretary and captain for being supposedly corrupt, alongside taking their newest ship by that point, the Antonio Maceo, for a tour cruise throughout the Caribbean, going to Cuba, Haiti, Panama, and Jamaica. Issue was that this visit was not without anxiety, as multiple insiders within the UNIA didn't want Garvey to depart just in case the US government tried to stop him from returning to the United States. And, in fairness, they were trying to do exactly that. However, through some local sympathies in Jamaica, Garvey managed to actually get himself a British passport, which the United States wouldn't be stupid enough to deny, even if they really super duper wanted to. Upon arriving in Jamaica, Garvey had some choice words to make at the expense of the British government. He proclaimed that Sir Winston Churchill was a, and I quote,
negro
hater, and that he will, quote, bankrupt Britain into the solvency she so much desires. Which, you know, story for another time. Alongside this, however, he ended up deriding the dregs of the audience themselves, apparently getting so blackpilled by the indifference of wider West Indian society that he ended up saying to them, and I quote,
negro
"Those are the most lazy, the most careless and indifferent people in the world, and it simply sickens one to feel that he is identified with such a people." Basically, Garvey just went full Uncle Ruckus. So, it's no surprise that he was pounced upon and heckled by his detractors, bringing up how he had no leg to stand on due to him leaving his dad, old Malchus, to die in an almshouse and refusing to pay the £46 cost for his upkeep when he was alive. It was only after he was threatened with a warrant for his arrest did Garvey finally pay up. You know, I'm starting to notice a pattern with Garvey and money. Garvey departed Jamaica and returned to Costa Rica instead of Panama due to the American consul being a gimp. Except that the Antonio Maceo had to go back to the United States for repairs. Because the second it departed Cuba, a fucking boiler exploded and killed one of the crew, leaving it adrift in the middle of the Caribbean. Upon actually getting to Costa Rica by commercial ferry, we see that the tables had turned. You see, our old chums in the United Fruit Company had actually paid for Garvey's travel costs, hoping that Garvey would keep them in his good books so that he doesn't do that whole racial firebrand routine. Especially seeing as how good chunks of the labour force were in the UNIA, and they would kick off if anything happened. As for what Garvey actually did, well, he just met with President Julio Acosta as a sort of ambassador for the black race. Of course, now that he was right next door, Garvey went down to Panama, though this time it didn't go quite as swimmingly, as alongside pressing him with questions about the Black Star Line investments, Garvey also doubled the entry price from 50 cents to $1 for his rally in Bocas del Toro and Almirante, which resulted in the crowd booing and berating him. Garvey prematurely closed out the event by stating, and I quote, "I cannot come all the way from New York to speak to you for 50 cents. And he also said to them, You are a bunch of ignorant and impertinent
negro,
no wonder you are where you are. And for my part, you can stay where you are. Now, at a glance, it might seem a little bit unreasonable for the crowds to get so worked up over a 50-cent price increase, even if it was advertised as cheaper. But you have to remember two things. First, account for inflation and you'll see that it was actually $9 marked up to $18. A little bit more of a punch to the treasury. Second, you've got to remember who was attending the event. They were labourers for the fucking United Fruit Company. You know, the company that quite famously didn't pay its employees in actual money, alongside literally funding and running death squads to keep labour movements in check. I could imagine that even 50 cents is quite the fucking commodity, let alone a full dollar. Anyways, despite all that Almirante malarkey, Garvey ended off his tour with a stop in Panama City, where he managed to receive much more fanfare before waddling back home. Though, of course, that was a lot more difficult than you would expect due to the United States denying his entry visa. Though that ended up being sorted out after Garvey channeled his inner Karen and complained directly to the State Department. Though, sadly for Garvey, his troubles would only get worse once he got stateside.
Can you talk?
Yes, boss. I can talk.
Somehow, Garvey has returned to the United States. And how has he fared? Well, shite. because he got himself arrested for mail fraud. And this time, he actually did it. Because you see, the Black Star Line was naturally always in a constant scramble to get investors. The issue was that, frankly, they didn't have a lot to show for the money that was being put in. Every single vessel under its employ was somehow cursed in one way or another, with even the old Yarmouth having to be sold to a scrapyard for 1/100th of its initial price due to it being an absolutely crusty piece of shit that didn't even work. This is to say that the Black Star Line was starting to get desperate, and another round of funds could be just what they needed in order to stave off the demonic white IRS. So Garvey decided to be a naughty little sausage and market the vessel Phyllis Wheatley as the new premier vessel of the Black Star Line. Formerly known as the Prince Oscar, she was a German-built boat that was seized and resold by the United States during World War I, and given the name Orion. The only issue was that Garvey didn't actually own the fucking boat. Now, Garvey did have every intention of actually buying the boat and renaming it to the Phyllis Wheatley as advertised. The only issue was he just hadn't done that yet. And deciding that the company needed money pronto, he grabbed some photos of the Orion when it was in dock, and then he scraped in the name Phyllis Wheatley on the side of the ship before taking another photograph of the now doctored vessel. Naturally, this was found out pretty quickly, and the Fed finally had the excuse they needed to get Garvey. And of course, they were gunning for a conviction. The thing is though, Garvey still had resources, so he managed to get out on bail. Upon getting out, he immediately went on a rally to vent and bitch about the whole ordeal. However, instead of complaining about the federal government, as you may expect, he instead went on to bitch about that rat bastard Dubois. No, seriously, he was absolutely convinced that the NAACP were conspiring to get him locked up. Because, of course, in the 1920s, the US government would absolutely conspire with a black rights group. This was taken by the press, who then went on to portray Garvey as a volatile and untrustworthy man, lashing out at all of his racial peers. And Garvey didn't exactly help with this perception, because Garvey then went on to meet with one Edward Young Clark, who was, at the time, the acting imperial wizard for the Ku Klux Klan. So why the fuck did Garvey meet with the KKK? Well, if you were paying attention, you may have realised that Garvey and the KKK actually agree about a lot of stuff. You know, just from slightly different angles. Despite this nuance, the meeting only made the situation worse. And understandably, there was a massive upset amongst basically every single black person in the New World, resulting in the Garvey Must Go campaign, which consisted of a coalition of influential black advocates pushing for Garvey's immediate deportation, which then apparently resulted in one of the black advocates getting threatened by the KKK for daring to demand the deportation of Garvey. These KKK guys hate black people, sure, but Garvey was their black guy. So they defended him.
I got more respect for that black man than I do you white. Sometimes we don't agree with everything, but at least he respects me to sit down and listen to me. And I'll respect him to sit down and listen to him.
Despite this, though, Garvey pressed on, marrying Amy Jacques in July of 1922. Though, according to Jacques, she, quote, did not marry for love. I did not love Garvey. I married him because I thought it was the right thing to do. Showing once again that even on what is supposed to be the happiest day for a couple, the woman will still find something to complain about. As well as that, the UNIA secured themselves another black figurehead in the form of Hubert F. Julian. Who's that? Well, he was the first ever black pilot. Another victory was also secured in that they actually managed to get a small delegation to the impotent Satanic League of Nations, where they would of course profess the plight of the
Negro
struggles to an audience that not only doesn't really fucking care, but quite famously couldn't even do shit to stop it, as Haile Selassie would later find out. Despite these token victories, however, the writing by this point was on the wall for Garvey, as infighting broke out within the UNIA, with Garvey trying to consolidate sole power of the organisation upon himself as an enlightened black autocrat, a black emperor as it were. Understandably, senior members of the cabinet didn't take too kindly to this, and after saying no to his stupid power-mad demand, Garvey resigned from the UNIA and the office of Provisional President of Africa in protest. An unorthodox move, to say the least. What really makes my head hurt is that this somehow actually fucking worked, with the cabinet yielding to their emperor and subsequently resigning or getting expelled from the group. One such man, Reverend James Eason, then went on to found a splinter group called the Universal
Negro
Alliance. I only bring this up because later on, in January of 1923, Reverend James Eason was lynched in New Orleans by Garvey loyalists. He was lynched by black people. A black man was lynched by other black people because he didn't like their favourite black man. You can't fucking make this shit up. But anyway, despite the fact that Garvey publicly denied being involved in this lynching in any way, Hoover and the Bureau of Investigation disagreed. And it definitely didn't help that the UNIA actually started a defence fund for the killers. This act quite simply made Garvey's already tenuous position in the public eye even more untenable, with a second coalition of black influencers calling for his removal from the United States, claiming him to be, quote, an unscrupulous demagogue. Garvey retorted these dissenters by accusing them of being, quote, the greatest bit of treachery and wickedness that any group of
Negro
could be capable of, claiming that they were all trying to get him done in because they were all mixed race. Because Garvey fucking hated mixed race people. Of course, seeing as Garvey was having yet another manic shit fit on Maine, who do you think showed up to kick him whilst he was down? Why, of course, another mixed race person. Fucking Dubois, as he ended up writing an article about Garvey just so he could needlessly inject himself into his arch-nemesis' downfall. Garvey was not amused by this serpentine behaviour and, of course, lashed out at him, saying Dubois was, and I quote, a hater of dark people, and an unfortunate mulatto who bewails every drop of
negro,
blood in his veins. None of you can ever comprehend how much Garvey and Dubois fucking hated each other. In May of 1923, Garvey finally had to face the music and go to court over the mail fraud with his 3 co-defendants. I know, I also forgot that all of this started over fucking mail fraud. But anyway, almost immediately Garvey was in a tiff over multiple things. For a start, he thought that the judge overseeing the trial, Julian Mack, was, as a matter of fact, a sympathiser for that bitch Dubois in the NAACP. And then his lawyer told him to just plead guilty so that he could get the lightest sentence possible. So, did Garvey follow the advice of a legal professional? Of course he fucking didn't. Instead, he actually sacked him and represented himself in court. And then, for the next month, he struggled to keep up with the trial due to not knowing fucking anything about US law. Despite that, he still had skills as an orator and he managed to have a belter of a closing statement, presenting himself as a selfless visionary weighed down and foiled by the incompetence and thieves beneath him, the federal government above him, and of course, that fucking prick Dubois. Despite the fire and vigour in his closing statements, it amounted to nothing but hot air, as Marcus Garvey was found guilty of mail fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison and a $1,000 fine, which is $18,000 in today's money. This was made even more insulting by the fact that Garvey was the only one of the 4 originally accused to actually be convicted. Everybody else walked free. This enraged Garvey and inspired him to have a Kanye episode, calling the district attorney and judge, quote, damn dirty Jews, alongside proclaiming that he was being fucked over by a Jewish cabal. This genuinely came out of absolutely fucking nowhere because up until this point, Garvey had never expressed anything shy of sympathy for the Jews. Garvey was even a Zionist. This sudden change could have come from his time interacting with the KKK, who are, quite famously, not fond of God's chosen people. But regardless, a week after the sentencing, 2,000 Garveyite loyalists met to formally denounce the conviction as nothing short of a complete miscarriage of justice. Despite being united in this, the UNIA had started to decline and fragment, with a growing rift between the Caribbean and American branches. Garvey, as always, stayed focused even when in prison, spending his days in the slammer writing articles and letters, most of which were of course complaining about that bitch Dubois and his cursed NAACP. By September, however, luck had struck, as he managed to get out on bail. Now a pseudo-free man, he decided to once more tour the United States, stopping by once again in the Tuskegee Institute to give a speech about the importance of segregation. Upon being pressed for his ties to the KKK, Garvey tripled down, saying that compared to that bitch Dubois and the NAACP, the KKK at least had more, and I quote, honesty of purpose towards the
negro.
Alongside this, the UNIA broke new ground by actually putting candidates up for election in the US, naturally focusing on areas with a large black population. Though, by complete coincidence, said candidates were only running in places where there was an already existing NAACP candidate. Small world, eh? Of course, the UNIA did not forget its main objective of black resettlement, and still actively tried to work towards it, Come February of 1924, another attempt was made when the UNIA approached Liberian President Charles D.B. King with a proposal to send 3,000 black American colonists to Liberia in exchange for the land to settle them on. Chipper Charlie assured them that he would grant them their lands. However, when the UNIA survey teams actually arrived in Liberia, they were immediately arrested and deported. When Garvey heard of this great betrayal, he of course was not amused, and he immediately blamed that bitch Dubois and the NAACP because they had gotten chummy with the Liberian elite around about the time that this deal was fostered. Dubois, of course, denied this, but frankly, they are both petty enough to do this sort of shit, especially to each other. But of course, bail is only temporary, and a year later, in February of 1925, the US Court of Appeals upheld the original court decision. This meant that Garvey's bail was voided, and he had once again been placed under arrest post-haste. And just like that, he was taken out of the public and dumped in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. So, how'd he fare? Well, not very well, as our emperor in exile was made a Johnny and he was constantly reprimanded for not showing the white guards enough respect. And it seems the work of a janitor was taking its toll on dear Garvey, as he would have constant spells of lung infections, bronchitis, and even fucking influenza. Despite this physical torture, Garvey was mentally kept sane by the steady stream of letters that he would get sent to him, from UNIA supporters to his own ambivalent wife, who, at the very least, actually had the decency to visit the man every few weeks. Amy Jacques also managed to compile multiple essays, leaflets, and memoirs of Garvey's into a book called The Meditations of Marcus Garvey. I wonder what that's alluding to. But anyway, alongside this, she also compiled a bunch of his speech transcripts into this, The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, which, as you guessed, contains the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey. And as you can see, he had an awful lot to say. Now for something completely out of left field. Garvey's ex-wife, Amy Ashwood, decided to try and legally challenge their divorce in an attempt to void it. No, I have no idea why the fuck she did this, but I felt it weird enough to bring up because who the fuck does that? It's not like Garvey was swimming in riches because he was in fucking prison. Also, I didn't know that that is a thing that you could do, and that is very fucking concerning. What Garvey did have, however, was support, as Attorney General John Sargent found out when a petition with the names of 70,000 pissed off black people got slapped on his desk. This naturally caused quite a bit of concern to dear Johnny Boy, and he felt compelled to warn the president, Calvin Coolidge, of this burgeoning black unrest. This resulted in Garvey having his sentence commuted after 2 years. Lucky break. But not really, because in return for his early release, Garvey was to be immediately deported back to Jamaica. And so, Garvey left Atlanta, moseyed on down to New Orleans to catch a boat to Cristobal in Panama, and then onwards back to Kingston. And just like that, Garvey had finally left the United States for real this time, once again returning to Jamaica against his will, with nothing but the clothes on his back and his squad in tow. Upon returning to Kingston, Garvey was surprised, as people actually showed up to support him. Mind you, they were in the UNIA, but still, that's a shock considering what he said to them last time he was there. Better yet, they actually raised him $10,000 to help him settle in Jamaica. Or, in today's money, a paltry $184,000. You know, a pittance, especially when it comes to buying a fucking home. With this small gift, he got himself a fancy estate in the nice part of the country that he christened the Somali Court. I have no fucking idea why, but what I do know is that his wife helped him to get all of his shit shipped over from the United States to fill the shelves of his new court, including over 18,000 books and hundreds of antiques, relics, and other such strange trinkets. Now that he was stuck in Jamaica, Garvey made the most of it, continuing to give speeches just like in the old days, mainly trying to get the Afro-Jamaicans to fight for better standards of living against the new migrants that had shown up to the island, including mainly the Chinese and the Syrians. He also tried to wrangle control of the now rogue sect of the UNIA, inviting the new president of the US branch over to Kingston to have a chat after the previous president was fucking assassinated in South Africa by a presumed Garvey loyalist. We can't say if the assassin was for certain a Garvey loyalist because the crowd that witnessed the assassination immediately beat him to death before he could be questioned. After attempting to once again leave Jamaica for Central America and finding that none of the governments there actually fucking wanted him, Garvey cyclically repeated history by instead going to East London. Upon finding that the first 50 hotels that he tried to book also didn't want him, he ended up renting himself a house in West Kensington for just a few months instead. Now, what did he do in London? Well, on June the 6th of 1928, he somehow managed to speak at Royal Albert Hall. Now, why was Garvey in London? Well, there was a small yet incredibly dedicated branch of the UNIA present in the city that was mostly made up of former seamen. There was a slight issue, however, in the fact that most of the blacks in London were men. There wasn't many women around. This was an issue because said black men would then start getting white partners. And Garvey quite famously hated race mixing and mixed race people. Like that bitch Dubois. Despite this though, Garvey very quickly found out what a lot of us today have also realised. That white women get caught up in virtue signalling very, very quickly. As when these women were brought to UNIA meetings, they were for some reason amongst the most passionate and eager for his message. Apparently being some of the loudest when it came to chanting, "Blacks back to Africa." This was either your standard white female liberal bullshit, or they were playing some 4D chess. Now, due to the rules of the UNIA, only black people can become proper members. But these white hoes were just so goddamn passionate about it that Garvey felt that he absolutely had to bend the rules somehow just to accommodate them. So, just for them, he set up an auxiliary unit within the UNIA. Because, of course, the black separatist group would have the fucking white bitch brigade within its rank and file. Despite this, though, Garvey kept moving around. He and Amy Jacques visited Paris, where in true Garvey fashion, he contributed a couple of articles to yet another fucking newspaper. This time being the African division of La Dépêche. And from there, he moseyed to Switzerland, and then over to Canada before being detained and getting banned from making any more speeches. Back in Kingston, the UNIA actually managed to get a hold of the ownership of Edelweiss Park in Kingston. Upon hearing about this, Garvey created the Edelweiss Amusement Company. Why? Well, you see, Garvey had written a couple of plays, and now he had a place to show said plays in the park. Why are you surprised that the chubby, flamboyant, intellectual black man has a flair for the dramatic? If he was not raised as a Jamaican labourer, he would have absolutely been an insufferable theatre kid. He set himself up as a pseudo-sea lord for fuck's sake, bicorn and everything. Alongside being Black Shakespeare, Garvey was also being not black. insofar as siring children that he actually raised, alongside taking in orphaned family members as his wards, with his two blood sons, Marcus III and Julius, sharing the same father figure as his niece, Ruth. Alongside being a father for his children, Garvey, in a way, became the father of contemporary Jamaican politics, as he founded the first modern political party in Jamaica, the People's Political Party, or the People's Progressive Party. They're still around, by the way, and I think Garvey might still actually be their ceremonial leader. So I'm not joking when I say that Marcus Garvey actually ran in the 2011 and 2016 Jamaican general elections. And I'm being completely serious when I say that in 2011, Marcus Garvey got 420 votes in the Jamaican general election. And that was somehow the third biggest political party on the island, because of fucking course. The party itself had a manifesto, and Garvey proclaimed it in a speech before a crowd of 1,500 people. The speech asked for things like implementing a minimum wage and building a university. And if Garvey were to get into power, he would pursue and imprison corrupt judges. In response, Garvey was charged with demeaning the judiciary and imprisoned for 3 months with a £100 fine. That's what we call a tell. Upon getting put in prison once again, Garvey had a shit fit, though this time for good reason. Upon publishing his thoughts in yet another fucking newspaper, a newspaper literally called The Black Man, Garvey was then charged with seditious libel, whilst still being in prison. This resulted in Garvey getting another 6 months added to his sentence, though thankfully it was appealed and overturned. By this point we are now in the 1930s, and the world was very different. Capone was kaput, Europe, after being molested by Woodrow Wilson and forced to live beside Bolsheviks, decided to start trying out some new trains of thought, inspired by some plucky Italian chap, and it's apparently all the rage, and most importantly for our story, we are in the middle of the Great Depression, and Garvey was starting to feel it. Garvey no longer had the funds that he used to. After picking up work as an auctioneer, remortgaging the Somali court, and selling off Edelweiss Park, he realised that he was frankly living the life of a miserable wretch in Jamaica. Again. And that frankly, he has to get out of this place. And so he did. In March of 1935, he packed his bags and boarded the SS Talapa with his hat and wife in tow. And he made his way to London again. This time for good. Pinky promise. Upon arriving, he settled himself once again in West Kensington, and he got up to his usual shit, including the setup of, yes, yet another fucking newspaper that was called The Black Man Journal. He also returned to Speaker's Corner to try and woo all of the white people, only to find an increasing amount of socialists harassing him just for being normal. Something quite important happened in 1935. You see, Mussolini's Italy was rather fond of map painting. And when they looked at their map holdings in the Horn of Africa, they noticed that it had a massive Ethiopia-shaped hole in it. So they invaded the Ethiopia-sized hole to conquer it. And thus we get the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, because they tried it before and they failed, being beaten back by hills and men with sticks. This would have been of no concern for Garvey, save for the fact that it not only had to do with Africa, but that it also affected Haile Selassie, who Garvey quite admired. Garvey immediately condemned the Italians for being heckin' warmongers and imperialists. Then October struck, to which Garvey then started criticising Haile Selassie due to him dropping the ball and leaving his slice of Africa underprepared for dealing with a surprise invasion, with Garvey claiming the reason Selassie was so shit is because he wasn't acting like a good Gyat-fearing Garveyite. Garvey considered the Ethiopian plight to be an embarrassment for the black race. This continual act of armchair general came to a head when Ethiopia was so far gone on the back foot that Haile Selassie and his government came to London in exile. Garvey thought of himself as important enough to warrant being present to greet the man when he was to arrive at Waterloo Station, seeing as he was, politically black. He, alongside a group of other black dignitaries, were present to greet the Ethiopian emperor, who then just walked straight past them without even doing so much as glancing at them. Garvey was not amused. Getting snubbed by someone actually important resulted in Garvey, of course, flying into yet another shit fit, where he would become outright hostile to Haile Selassie and in the process alienating basically every Pan-Africanist and black activist in the Western world. And this included large swathes of his own supporters in the UNIA. Presumably deciding that he needed to clear his head, Garvey decided to partake in another tour of the Caribbean and Canada to do the usual rounds of attending UNIA conferences and generally trying to be important like the good old days. Concurrently with his travels overseas, however, his wife and kids moved back to Jamaica without his knowledge, on the recommendations of a doctor due to Marcus III having rheumatism. Upon returning to London, Garvey naturally flew into yet another rage, though this time he had nobody to obnoxiously vent his soliloquy at. And seeing as the UNIA was in its long, slow death spiral with money drying up, he decided to meet up with his bitch ex-wife for what I could only assume was a tear-filled booty call, as, by complete coincidence, she was also living in London at the time. The thing is, though, the stress of all of this was starting to get far too much for Garvey, as in January of 1940 he suffered a stroke that left him mostly paralysed and reliant on his secretary to care for him. This resulted in Trinidadian socialist George Padmore reporting to multiple newspapers that Garvey had died. For context, George and Garvey really did not see eye to eye. And while I don't think George necessarily lied, I would not be surprised if he had assumed the best case scenario. Regardless of intention, the news spread like wildfire, with papers all across the world unanimously proclaiming the death of Marcus Garvey, despite the fact that he was still a living vegetable in Kensington. Come May of 1940, Garvey had the displeasure of reading his own obituaries in multiple newspapers that he probably created, because he's not normal. Now, this is according to his secretary, so there's a chance that it might not be true. But the obituaries were not very kind. And they also condensed his entire life of achievements into a tiny paragraph that you could fit on a postage stamp. So Garvey lay in bed reading these obituaries, absolutely fucking seething. And apparently on the second day of Garvey reading his own obituaries, he suffered another massive stroke. And this one he would not recover from, resulting in his death on the 10th of June 1940 at the age of 52. Of course, in true Garvey fashion, it can't just end there. As amongst the outpour of grief and sorrow that overcame the black community, there was also some funky shit happening. For example, multiple members of the UNIA straight up denied Garvey's death, claiming it was a white conspiracy meant to try and demoralise the black race. Even being so bold as when they were literally shown photos of Garvey laying in his casket, they doubled down and still denied it, claiming that the photos of his corpse were doctored. Garvey, in time, would go on to get a mythical and, dare I say, somewhat deified reputation amongst some circles of Pan-Africanists. He was literally canonised by Rastafarians as a fucking prophet. I'm being completely serious, they actually celebrate his birthday as a religious holiday. Which is made even funnier by the fact that Garvey didn't fucking like Rastafarians. And I can completely see why. He had a larger-than-life presence with a religious background and fantastic oratory skills. And that was when he was alive. Now, said presence was unshackled from this mortal coil and primed to infest the minds of millions. Including that bitch Dubois, who didn't even have the guts to celebrate Garvey's death, going so far as to begrudgingly pay his respects to him in his autobiography in the 1960s. And I just know that Garvey was probably laughing at him from black segregated heaven for being such a spoon. Of course, somehow, despite this being the last hurrah of Marcus Garvey, the women managed to make all of it all about themselves, as both Amy Jacques and Ashwood donned the title of the widow of Marcus Garvey, and, in a truly tasteful and respectful manner, argued and sued each other over who had rightful custody of his body. The thing is, though, Garvey was a smart cookie, and he left a will. His request was merely that he be buried in Jamaica. This simple request took far longer to manifest than you would expect due to the legal troubles of the bickering widows, and also a whole world war making the oceans a little bit too dangerous to cross. It wasn't until 1964 that his wish was finally fulfilled, with his body being laid in state at the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Kingston, where thousands came to pay their respects to their fallen emperor, with some being so overcome with grief that they went so far as to permanently move to Jamaica just to be closer to where Garvey was buried, which is currently in the National Heroes Park in Kingston.
I'm finished.
When I first heard about Marcus Garvey, it came from the delirious and convincingly schizophrenic ramblings of one of my staff members, the one that you all know as Africa Chan. You see, for whatever reason, he is just absolutely fucking obsessed with Africa. He's just obsessed with it, and he just finds it particularly alluring, and this usually just manifests as him detailing some frankly stupid trivia about the happenings of some dipshit tribe in the Congo that I really don't care about. But Garvey here had Africa Chan fucking stimming all over the office because he's autistic as fuck while yelling out quotes that Marcus Garvey said in an Uncle Ruckus voice. You see, these aren't props, these are real. He got these from Ghana. These are actual real clothes that he got from Ghana. That's how fucking obsessed he is. So I let my infinite empathy overrule my better judgment, and just this once I let him indulge in his weird little autistic hyperfixation so that I can get some video content and he has an outlet for his little obsession. And I am never fucking doing that again. Look at the length of this fucking video. Never ever ever ask one of your autistic researchers to make a video about a subject that he is fucking obsessed with. Garvey is actually one of the few examples that I can think of where I can confidently say that he did way too much shit in his life. He's some fucking nobody that somehow affected nearly everything within the last century of history. Every time we started to briefly cover some minor fact of the man, it ended up getting us sucked down some fucking massive rabbit hole of just weird shit. And the fucked up thing is, we didn't even come close to covering everything. Initially, I was going to do a cute little, what are the UNIA? And to have a little segment about that where I would look through what they believe, policy by policy, to see if I'm mentally black enough to become an honorary member. But then, the word count shot past 15,000 and I had to tell him to pack it the fuck in because we've got videos to make and I can't have you sitting there for a whole fucking month churning out about 10,000 words a day because you're obsessed with this shit. But the worst part is that the content itself was just that fucking wild that I just felt the need to keep it in anyway, which is why this video is so long. The only real piece of trivia that got cut was the fact that the current flag of Ghana is literally an homage to Marcus Garvey, with the black star meaning to pay respects to the Black Star Line, because of course it does. Just everything black, everything to do with blackness and black people and black music and black culture and black politics all links back to Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is literally the main character of black people.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just...